We are all here. Does everyone have a copy of this? 30 Reasons Why Marriage Matters, third edition, just published, yeah? Also hot off the presses. This is the new and improved version because in the last version, the second edition, published I think in 2005, there were only 26 reasons. So we seem to have developed 4 new reasons to support marriage in only, what's that, 6 years. Let's starting with Brad, the obvious question, what are the 4 new points and why do they matter?
Thanks, Jonathan. I think the big point we're making in this report is that we focused for a long time in the sort of marriage world on divorce. And what is now appearing in the research is that cohabitation is really the most central challenge facing ordinary kids in American life. And so our first point is that kids are less likely to thrive in cohabiting households than kids in intact married households. That's the first point that we're making. The second point we're making in the report is that instability in kids' lives is also is a bad thing. The third point is that unfortunately instability is rising in the US. We see about 66% of kids in the late 1970s living with mom and dad at age 16, whereas today it's about 55% at age 16. So there is a decline in stability in American kids' lives. And the fourth point we make is that kids living in complex families where they have adults or kids with whom they're not related by blood or by marriage are more likely to suffer. So those are the 4 new points we're tackling in the report this year, Jonathan. Really.
So these are big things, right? Yeah. We're dealing with some of the major now institutional behaviors of American life. Instability, cohabitation, these things go together, yes?
Yes, definitely.
And is marriage the cause, lack of marriage the cause, or is it simply a byproduct? There's this causality question, you know, it always comes up, right? Is the problem that people are getting married less, therefore the outcomes are worse, or is it that, is the situation the other way around?
Well, yeah, even in the NPR report this morning, there was this sort of debate about whether it's really, you know, the retreat from marriage driving more instability, or is it shifting economic patterns in American life? And I would say it's actually both, that kind of the shifting foundations of economic life for working class and poor Americans make it harder for them to get and stay married, to enter into and form stable families. But it's also the case, too, that sort of the loss of a cultural ideal and a set of norms and rituals and roles that we sort of link to marriage is also implicated in this as well. So it's not an either or, it's a both and kind of story here.
Can we tease those out at all?
Well, in our report that we did in December called When Marriage Disappears, we look at sort of the cultural, the economic, and the civic foundations of the retreat from marriage. And we find that actually the cultural shifts were the most powerful empirical predictor of this retreat from marriage. So that's one empirical take at this, but I think they're all in play.
What cultural factors are we talking about? Well, I want to come to Amy on this in a second, but give us an overview.
Well, shifting attitudes towards divorce and to sex are an important part of that, but I think kind of more fundamentally, and this touches on your work as well, as kind of a shift in the direction of kind of a more short-term, a more hedonistic orientation to life, rather than a kind of a classically bourgeois, more restrained, you know, self-controlled orientation to life.
Immediate gratification.
Yes, that's part of it, yeah.
This comes right to the heart, I think, of Amy, your work. Maybe you could give us a summary version of what your findings are.
Okay, well, I'm very interested in family demography. It really started with my interest in poverty and equality issues, and my investigations over a period of time have convinced me that by far the most important forces in the decline in marriage and just in increasing family instability are cultural. I actually don't think, based on my research, that economics has that much to do with it. I think that gets the arrow of causality in the reverse direction. If I had to attribute the change to one force or one factor, I would call it the demoralization of sexual and family life, the deregulation of sexual and family life. I know it's a cliche to blame the 1960s, but I blame the 1960s. No problem with that. Now, it's a little more complicated than that. A lot of good things came out of the 60s, but a lot of bad things did too. And I think one of the interesting phenomena which has fascinated me is the divergence by class and race of the decline in marriage and the explosion in out-of-wedlock child-rearing. Charles Murray, who's sort of a hero of mine and a pretty good demographer, once said that the challenge is not to explain the failures, but the successes. So if we look at what's happened in the wake of the demoralization of sex, we see a sort of upper middle class, I'm going to say a white and mostly Asian upper middle class, because the demoralization of sexuality has really hit minorities hard, but it's essentially talking the 60s and living the 50s. They're getting married at very high rates, their divorce rates are declining, their children are living with two married parents, usually their biological parents. The phenomenon of sort of serial monogamy is greatly exaggerated when you start looking at the numbers, and I would urge you to look at the actual numbers and not what the New York Times says is happening. So the question is, now that we all believe in family diversity and sexual liberation, why are college-educated white people living such traditional lives? That requires an explanation, and everybody else is increasingly living chaotic domestic lives, much to the detriment, I think, of them and their children. And they are not happy about that. They say that they aspire to what better educated and better off people have. So in my article, I don't want to go on too long, you can read it, but I use a model created or thought up by, of all people, Richard Herrnstein of bell curve infamy. But before he became infamous for writing the bell curve, he was a very highly respected social psychologist. And he had the insight that there is no such thing as one model of rational choice that we as rational creatures all engage in. If that were true, we'd all make the optimal decision. There would be no such thing as dysfunction. But of course, we know that there are bad choices. We know that there's dysfunction, right? So he created a model of local choice where we look just at the consequences immediately in front of us. He called that local choice. And then global choice, where we look at the consequences for a long period of our life, right? What I do in my paper, and I won't go into details, is I explain how with a simple model that some people engage in local choice with respect to their personal behavior and their sexual behavior, and what I model it on is a choice to be unfaithful sexually, which is a complete relationship buster even today. Okay, because everybody expects monogamy in romance. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen and it hasn't happened, forever. I'm just saying it is still a complete relationship buster. And the decision not to be unfaithful. And in fact, if you're a global chooser, you're going to, I prove in my paper, most of the time be faithful, even though the person in front of you is more attractive than your spouse. If fidelity depended on the person in front of us not being more attractive than our spouse, then marriage wouldn't exist, right? At least for the moment. And you can just use sexual behavior to explain the whole thing. Now it turns out, and this is my last comment, and I'll talk more if you want to hear more about this model. It has nothing to do with economics. Okay? I show in my paper that in fact high school graduate males make no more today than they did in 1955, and yet they were married at much higher rates. So you have to look back in time in order to do that economic comparison. If you look at the curves for divergence in family structure, out-of-wedlock childbearing, which plays like that since about 1955, it perfectly tracks the obesity pattern by class and race. Now, isn't that interesting? We've deregulated eating too, right? So the people who are most capable of organizing their own lives and of exercising restraint and self-regulating, they're still self-regulating. They're the most privileged in society. But the least privileged people, they're the ones who really need norms, guidelines, traditions, customs to guide their behavior, and we have basically abandoned those people.
It's a very Burkean argument, and as one of perhaps the world's only two Burkean social conservative advocates of same-sex marriage, I find it very appealing. We'll come back if we have time to why I think Professor Wax's case is an argument for same-sex marriage. It's an argument I've made for a long time. But I'd like now to bring Elizabeth into the conversation. The surprise to me about your being so closely associated with this report is that you've emphasized for years this issue of instability caused by divorce. And the headline of this edition of this report, very interesting, I thought, because counterintuitive, is that cohabitation has now replaced divorce as the #1 threat to stability in children's family lives and the #1 thing that policymakers and others who care about the family ought to focus on. Is that a fair, do you agree with that assessment in this report?
I do agree with it. The fact that cohabitation, as social scientists are finding, is now...
Can everyone hear?
That cohabitation is the driving force in rising rates of family instability in the US today. For quite some time, I've been saying, sort of to myself, but I'm going to try it out on you all tonight, that it could be that children of divorce are the lucky ones. And
whoa.
Yes, and I say that.
Parents got married.
And this is, this is coming from someone I spent practically a decade of my life trying to write a book to convince people that divorce is really, 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 really hard for kids, which I still believe. And yet, with divorce is an institution. It has a structure, it has a name. You can describe it to people. You know when it happens. Cohabitation is none of those things. You don't know when it starts, you don't know when it ends. What is your mom's ex-live-in boyfriend to you? What if you liked him and you miss him? What if his son, you were close to his son over the summer and then you never see that kid again? How do you name who those people were in your life, much less describe the loss of those people in your life? So I think part of what we're seeing now is social scientists starting to catch up with what's been an emerging reality, which is that for some time, divorce, it's not as clean as kids are experiencing married parents or their parents are divorced or their parents are remarried. Cohabitation has been an increasing feature of that, which means, and family instability that comes along with it. So the reality for many people whose parents either never got married or who got divorced is that they've had these complex family forms and multiple family transitions of having half-siblings and step-siblings and ex-step-siblings and your mom's boyfriend and your dad's girlfriend and all those, and then there's flux in both families.
So when Amy talks about the chaos that exists outside of the well-worn groove of marriage,
yeah.
Another word for that chaos is essentially cohabitation? All the stuff
well,
that
not
falls
necessarily
in that
cohabitation, but what happens
and
when parents, a child's mother and father are not able to form and sustain a bond which we call marriage around the time of the birth of that child. There's much more instability and change that's likely to happen in not just one family system for the child, but two, because children whose parents are not together, if they stay in contact with both parents, are growing up in two family systems that tend to have a lot of instability with them. But we have this reality that's only now beginning to be sort of documented by social scientists, and we still don't really have culturally names for all this. And it was one of the things that was so gratifying to me when I was reading drafts of the report that Brad and the other scholars on the team were putting together. I am someone who grew up with multiple divorce in my childhood, parents living together, remarriage, ex-step parents, and I feel like I'm finally starting to see what my experience was documented and kind of talked about for the first time.
Do all three of you agree that currently cohabitation is a bigger threat, a word that's used in the report, to the well-being of children than divorce?
Well, let me just say that I think the word cohabitation is a little bit misleading because cohabitation spans a lot of different patterns. I mean, there are stable cohabiting couples. I don't think that's the main pattern. As you go, once again, this is very class sensitive. There are stable cohabiting couples who are together for a very long period of time and live orderly lives. But what I think is really alarming is what I would call short-term volatile coupling. I don't know how to express it, but the kind of extremely short-term volatile coupling and recoupling that we're seeing in increasing segments of the population. The name for it in demography, very euphemistic, is actually, it's oriented to children, is multi-partner fertility. You know, that means having kids by several different people. Yeah. That's an alarming new pattern that is very much on the rise. Right. So that would be my
Can I just
take
piggyback on one thing?
Yeah,
I mean, one of the things that the challenges I find with this about the cohabitation issue is that researchers are using words to study and talk about something that are not words that people experience it use. So, for instance, if you're married or if you're divorced, you say to people, I'm married, this is my husband, this is my wife, we're divorced, that's my ex. Regular people don't say I'm cohabiting with someone. They don't say I had a 6-month cohabitation relation. You know, they talk about living together or hanging out, or so the experience itself actually is often more squishy and ill-defined, which is actually part of the problem, particularly from the child's point of view.
Lack of definition of a kind of relationship with boundaries, expectations, social rules around it that help maintain and support the relationship. So, Brad, is the problem here the absence of those social boundaries, the absence of marriage? Is the problem cohabitation and all the stuff in that bucket, or is the problem, as Amy suggests, a certain type of cohabitation that's volatile and that's predominant in the lower socioeconomic echelons? Help us sort through all of this stuff we've got.
Well, I think the big problem here is that people are having kids
Talk loud.
Are having kids outside of marriage, and then when their marriages or their relationships break down, they're entering into new relationships with other people outside of marriage. And those are typically in cohabiting relationships. So especially in terms of the non-marital childbirths, now majority of those are to couples who are living together at the time of the birth of the child. So at least from a numerical perspective, it is the case that kind of the dominant pattern now when it comes to non-marital childbearing is cohabitation. And that's problematic because on many different outcomes, things like delinquency, things like dropping out of high school, things like using drugs, and even more so, child abuse, you see that kids who are in cohabiting households are much more likely to suffer and they're much more likely to be abused. So I think this is a sort of a wide-scale phenomenon. It's partly about sort of quickly moving in and out of relationships, but it's also more, I think, fundamentally about not having the norms, the rituals, the roles that kind of lend strength and stability and direction and purpose to relationships like marriage does. And that is then linked to all the pathologies that we see with regards to kids in cohabiting households.
So are we talking here about a specific type or a class of cohabitations? Well, that's a big problem?
What's interesting is that they're really, I mean, you know, to sort of simplify it to two models, you're having basically people who are the biological parents of their kids cohabiting, and you have a situation where it's often the mom cohabiting with an unrelated male boyfriend. And that latter model, that cohabiting stepfamily, is the most problematic and the most dangerous model of any American family model that we see in the US right now. But it's still the case that kids who are cohabiting with their biological parents are at greater risk of things like failing in high school, even of being abused, compared to kids who are being raised by their married biological parents.
Okay, so take a child with a cohabiting biological parent couple, marry that couple. Just do that. Just get them married. Nothing else happens. Does the kid's life improve?
Well, I think the big if there is if the parents recognize and appreciate the importance of marriage. And if they can kind of shift gears and understand and appreciate sort of the institution of marriage to some degree, then yes, the kid's life improves. And also, too, it's important to note that they are then viewed differently by friends and family and by their institutions in the society, so that it's not just sort of how the parents look at their relationship, it's how the broader society then looks at them as a family.
So marriage itself, the mere fact of marriage, brings something important to the table, but is not the whole story. And Amy, you wanted to...
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that's very much the way a social scientist thinks about it, which is everything else being equal, would marriage make a difference? But I guess my comment would be that in a society that really valorizes marriage, everything else would not be equal. I mean, marriage, the fact of marriage goes with so many understandings and conventions and expectations and a sense of sort of permanence and solemnity. I mean, it never is everything else being equal. I mean, certainly what we are striving for is a society in which it wouldn't be they get the piece of paper and all else is equal. I think that's sort of a little bit of a red herring for what we're looking towards.
Elizabeth, have you thought at all about, cohabitation's not a subject on the national radar at all. I mean, divorce really isn't either, but cohabitation even less, and it's very sensitive. Have you given any thought to how to generate any kind of policy handle on cohabitation?
There are wise people who have. I have to say, mostly the way my work tends to be descriptive, and I tend to focus on telling, I kind of have a good liberal faith that if people are just more educated, they'll make better choices. So I say that kind of with apologies.
Amy's Amy's smiling because she's just finished telling us that only works for a certain part of the population.
No,
it's not going to work for the others.
I disagree with it for other reasons. But
what we can do to support, the many of the good policy ideas that are on the table to support marriage, obviously there are also, these are address cohabitation or that issue as well. I mean, one of the things that just really strikes me about what's happening now is that when you think about who we're talking about people in their 20-somethings. Most babies are born to women in their 20s. People in their 20s today were born in the 1980s. That's hard for some of us to kind of grapple with that. So we're talking about people who were born at the height of some of these family trends, of family, at least the height of the divorce revolution. It kind of peaked and leveled off in the 1980s. And these are the folks who are now having children, many of them unmarried themselves. And the folks who are doing that, as Brad and others have documented, increasingly, we used to see very fragile family formation trends among kind of the underclass, and those trends have crept upwards to high school educated people. The person kind of numerically most likely to have an out-of-wedlock child in America today is a high school educated white woman. So these are folks who they don't have the benefit of higher education, they're not getting married, they're also less connected to institutions of to religion, they're less churched. We kind of think of this, I think we used to assume more reasonably that people out in rural America were, at least they had church to and these people are less churched. And they're less connected to secure financial institutions as well. Some other work we're doing at the Institute is how much these folks are kind of being preyed upon by anti-thrift institutions, and they have less good resources for saving money. So you have people who are deinstitutionalized in so many ways, and they are the ones who are now having children. And that's the story that I'd like to see getting out in America today, because to me it's an extremely poignant story of just how unmoored these children and young people are.
There is this view, which I don't know if any of you have looked at it, but that the exceptional pattern in American history is not the 60s, it's the 50s. That in fact you had a fairly brief period of a couple of decades where you saw these very stable nuclear family structures, but that before that you had all kinds of chaos going on in family structures at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. We just didn't hear about it because they all lived, in the slums of the Battery or whatever, and they didn't get into national media. Is there anything to that the exception is the 50s and not the present?
no.
No?
No, because
Okay.
Demographically, look, there's one key, maybe two key parameters that you need to look at. Let's start with the first one, the out-of-wedlock childbearing rate. What percentage of children were born out of wedlock? You look back to 1950, to 1940, 1930, all the way back to 1900, okay? It's a mere fraction, you can go back further than that if you want, a mere fraction of what it is today. I mean, today we're getting up to 50%. That is completely unprecedented, right? And interestingly, the rate for white college-educated women is still around 4 to 5%, astonishing figure, okay? So that is a huge change. Just the move away from marriage as the prerequisite to childbearing is unique in our history. The 50s were different in some ways in that people married earlier, a lot earlier. If you look back to the 20s, the teens, and before, people waited a lot longer to get married for various reasons. I mean, there are changes for sure. Childbearing today is much later. Those changes but the marriage rates have also plummeted. I mean, if you go back to 1930, 1920, 1900, the percentage of people getting married for blacks, for whites, for people from every group was far higher than it is today. I mean, let's just talk about blacks. The black marriage rate compared to 1940 there's no comparison. Ironically, things for blacks are far better today than they were back then, and yet controlling economically, socially, I mean, any which way that you can think about it in toto, and yet, so I think those two parameters to me tell the story.
If I'm a baby about to be born and I can pick my parents, my first choice, and the only thing I know about them is marital status or family status. I don't know race or money or anything else. My first choice, you would all agree, is married biological parents, right? Easy, no question.
The way I would want to put it is that I would want to be to have the two people whose sexual union made me stick with me. And
married or stick with you?
Well, marriage is a much better. I mean,
okay. So all I know is marital.
The marriages do break up, but cohabiting relationships break up far more. So yeah, I'd like my two people who had sex to stick together and be married and raise me. Yeah,
I'm going to take that as a yes. That my first choice is married biological parents. Then the question is, what's my second choice? If I have to choose between a single parent, probably a mother, or cohabiting couple, if the cohabiting couple is my biological parents, I want that, right? Because at least my father is more likely to be around, correct?
Temporarily.
Okay. Yeah. Now let's make it a little harder and say both of those options are off the table. And number two is much worse than number one. But now my choice is single mom or single mom with unrelated boyfriend.
Single
mom.
Yeah.
Whoa.
I want my single mom devoted to me.
The
downside is
that
that's not so great for the mom.
No.
Unrelated boyfriends are a bad idea.
Okay, what about step parents?
Less bad idea, but still not so stable.
Not as good as people think.
The thing about being a step-parent, and there's probably some
families are very troubled.
There's some wonderful step-parents in this room, I am sure, and I had a couple of great step-parents myself. But the thing about you don't get involved in a step-family because you want to marry these kids. That's why adoption works so well on average, because you adopt a child because you want to make a commitment to that child. You don't form a step-family because you want to make a commitment to the child necessarily. At least that's not your first interest. Your first interest is you want to be the sexual partner of this person, and the kid comes in the bargain. So that can be hard.
So in the report, a lot of this stuff is summarized in the word complex household.
Right.
Brad, what's a complex household?
It's a household where, once again, people are not necessarily related to one another by birth or by marriage, where you have half siblings, where you have step siblings, where you have step parents, or an unrelated male in the household. And what's interesting is that social scientists are expressing increasing frustration about actually measuring and tracking and analyzing the increasingly complex families that they encounter in the real world. So if you've got PhDs having trouble with this, imagine how a 3-year-old deals with all this. That's the sort of thing we have to think about. How kids experience complexity in this context can be really disorienting for them and troubling for them.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please.
I've actually written about this. I think the two keys here are responsibility and authority. Clarity in who's responsible for whom. Clarity in who has authority over whom. And the lines of responsibility and authority are necessarily muddied in these complex families. Children don't know who gets to give them orders, who gets to tell them what to do, who they have to obey, right? And they don't know who is ultimately responsible for them, who's going to pay their bills, who's going to help them out, who's going to put them through college, right? I mean, those of us who are lucky enough to, I think, to have conventional nuclear families know things are hard enough when the lines are clear, right? But when they're not, it's hopeless.
So what we're dealing with here is doing something a little difficult, it sounds like, which is, for years we've been hearing the problem is single moms, single moms, single moms. If you have a single mom, your chances of poverty go from, 5% to 30% and so forth. I don't know the numbers offhand, but some of you do. Now we're complicating the story a bit, right?
We are, but I think the good news in this report is that divorce has come down to almost pre-divorce revolution levels, and I think that's in part a consequence of the work that we've all been doing over the last 30 years in terms of trying to educate the public about the importance of two parents, the importance of marriage. So that message, I think, has penetrated into the consciousness of at least some portion of the broader public. And so I think the challenge before us now is to educate the public about the ways in which cohabitation poses risks to kids, and to steer clear of that when it comes to either having kids, or for those people who are remarrying, for instance, or entering into a new relationship, not cohabiting after a divorce has taken place.
So Brad, let me push back on that just a little. What if the story isn't, okay, divorce is coming down, that's good, we like that.
Right.
But meanwhile, what's happening there is a reparation potentially, and this is a question, by the way, is a restoration of marriage in the upper half or whatever of the distribution.
Right.
Whereas in the lower half of the distribution, instead of divorce, you're getting all of these other substitutes for marriage. So the end result of this is not sort of a healing of marriage as divorce comes down, it's a bifurcation in marriage as essentially you get a class division in which you've got two very different sets of behavior around marriage. One which is quite privileged and potentially self-sustaining, one which is much less privileged, much more vulnerable, and also potentially self-sustaining. Is that right? Are we sort of splitting that direction?
We are moving right now in a two nations direction, which is, I think, deeply troubling when it comes to marriage and many other things in our society. But with regards to the stability, the increasing stability of marriage among the well-educated set, part of the reason that's taken place is that their attitudes towards things like divorce have become more marriage-minded. So culture has had an impact in this segment of the population. So the idea, I think, is to try to figure out how we can get a marriage-friendly message to move down the social ladder and to have a similar impact, for those Americans who are working-class Americans or who are poor.
Can we do that, Amy? I mean, can you, if the fragmentation has to do with factors that are very hard for education to address because you've got all these local decision makers, can you reach those people with educational cultural education?
Well, I'm going to answer that in sort of an indirect way. Because I am in the world of academia, so I'm in a kind of rarefied world where ideas matter, or they seem to matter. I really think that nothing good is going to happen until the very elites who are living the most traditional lives sort of get straightened out on the message that they're sending. I think a really fascinating phenomenon is, as I said, talking the 60s and living the 50s. If you read the New York Times, they're always celebrating family diversity. They don't ever want to say anything critical or even remotely critical about all of these sort of chaotic domestic relationships, about father abandonment, about the most outrageously irresponsible behavior, which if the people we knew and the friends we have engaged in it, we'd just be aghast, right? But we're not supposed to be judgmental. So there's all of this kind of muzzy-headed confusion about the demoralization of sex. I think there's also really a willful blindness about the facts. Once again, I'm going to, tar the New York Times because I've dealt with them. I've dealt with the editorial page. They just don't want to know about this stuff. They will always put a spin on it that goes with the ideology that, I don't know where they get it, but it's there. So I think there is a kind of let them eat cake attitude that the elites have about this, and until that attitude changes, I don't see the patterns changing at all. There's just an unbelievable kind of excuse-making industry out there saying you cannot expect working class people to get married. I think it's total bunk. I think that marriage is something. It is the core cooperative relationship of society. And it is the way that people build a life and get ahead. You don't get a life first and then get married. I don't know where we got that idea, where that idea came from. It's really quite the opposite ought to be the norm.
Well, the pushback that one would get from that is, so the answer is the New York Times and the people who read it should go around pointing their fingers at lower class people who are not married and say, your lifestyle is no good.
Yeah.
Shape up, be more like us.
Well, I mean, people used to do that all the time. You know,
And we do it on other issues. We do it on obesity and smoking and teen pregnancy
anymore?
And, so.
What are we afraid of?
Yeah.
But I think too, it's about painting a positive, picture. You know, in not so much in Manhattan, but even really in Hollywood. That is to sort of offer a different vision of family life in the engines of culture that are much more influential among ordinary Americans than the New York Times is. You know, so it's really about kind of getting to producers and writers and that kind of set to help them understand that this matters and that they can offer a different, more positive vision of family life that will then influence, hopefully to some extent, people who spend a lot more time listening to their, you know, their iPad or their iPhone.
Whatever those gadgets are that those young people are using nowadays.
Or watching the latest TV show on cable.
Reality television. If we could get reality television on board, then we'd be set.
You know, there is this evidence, Cherlin and others have dug up, that shows there is not a problem with people in the lower socioeconomic statuses devaluing marriage.
Sure. Right.
If anything, they value it too much. They put it on such a high pedestal. They say, I'm not going to get married if it's a young woman until, you know, I find a man who can really support me, until I'm educated, until she sets all kinds of goals which she can't meet and therefore does not get married. Right. So it's not that they don't value marriage, right?
Well,
it's that marriage is not automatic
the hard things
anymore.
you need to do to make a marriage, you know, get formed in the first place and succeed in the second place. So it's not just about sort of marriage in the abstract, but actually kind of the set of virtues and values that make a real marriage in the real world possible.
Well, that's what happens, I think, when the guideposts come down and the expectations and the norms just dissolve. I mean, it used to be that, you know, being an adult was defined as, you know, doing certain things, including getting married, establishing a household. The role of, you know, men and of husbands and wives were clear. I mean, all of that, I think, is no longer clear. These are the little baby steps that ordinary people need to take to get from point A to point B. You can't just posit an ideal and say, you know, I aspire to this ideal. We have to set out the kind of road and the guideposts to get there. It's a little bit like eating. I'm actually going to analogize it to eating. We've got a total free-for-all for eating, right? We don't sit down to meals. We eat between meals. We've got snack food. The conventions are all gone. We don't have these kind of slightly moralistic proscriptions about having seconds and, you know, having soda pop and all that dessert. And I mean, all of this kind of negative normalization, the finger wagging, you know, that sort of thing.
But to be clear, we've got to do this in a new way for a new day. We can't go back necessarily
that's the question.
to, you know.
I mean, everybody's terrified of disapproval for reasons I have never understood, but maybe I'm just a creature from another planet.
But I do hold out hope that we can connect with people's hearts, in that people who grew up without their dad around know how painful it is not to have your dad around, and I think that can be a place to connect with someone. What can we do so that you can write a different story for your kid? You know, you want to be there for your kid because you know what it feels like not to have your dad, right? And most of those people would say, yeah, I want to, but that person needs help, needs an institutional structure to help, because it's hard.
Part of the problem the school I'm referring to posits is that in some ways people at the bottom are being too imitative of people at the top. The rule at the top of the spectrum is don't get married until you finish college and preferably have a graduate degree. Well, that's not a rule that's going to work for people who are often not even finishing high school. So the messages we're sending are get married late, get married when you're ready.
Keep your options open.
Keep your options open. So this is a tough issue. I mean, it's really interesting how you renorm in a bifurcated society when you can no longer plausibly just send a single message, and when the top can no longer say, just be more like us. Because frankly, a lot of these people in the lower, whatever you call them, SESs are not going to college.
You want to talk about a controversial issue these days. A couple years ago, we released a marriage index, and one of the things we measured was how many people ages 15 to 50, I believe it was, that's because that's how the census does it, are married. And people were appalled that we even included, no, it was ages 20 to 50. They said we should not have been including people in their early 20s, or maybe not even in their 20s at all. We shouldn't even count how many people in their early 20s get married, because this was considered to be too young to get married. So there's this odd thing that we've done where we've achieved a pretty good consensus that teenage childbearing is a bad idea and teen marriage is a bad idea. But there's this odd, to me, idea that getting married in your early 20s, if you're responsible and you found the right person, and is somehow bad. And I don't know where that came from, but that apparently is fighting words in some sectors today.
Well, the highest rate of teen childbearing was in the 1950s. It's that they were all married.
They were married, yeah.
Right. That's true. I mean, I'm the numbers woman. I crunch these numbers, and they're interesting.
It's about time to take questions. Before we do, I would just want to bring up one more area which is implicit but not really teased out in this document, which is the issue of race. There's a new book out by a fellow named Ralph Richard Banks, which I recommend you all look at, in which he argues that marriage is in effect turning white. Professor Banks is, I think, at Duke. Not sure about that.
This is Stanford.
Oh, Stanford, yeah. Thank you. And he is African American. And it's a pretty brave book, because he argues that for black women, being unmarried has become the new normal. Single is the new black. And the statistics are pretty striking, and I have to confess I hadn't heard them. Nearly 7 of 10 black women, 7 out of 10 are unmarried, twice the unmarried proportion as in the 1950s, and as many as 3 out of 10 black women will never marry. Is the racial component here, it's hard to ask these questions sensitively. To what extent are the problems we're talking about focused on the black community, and to what extent should we look at this as a problem with the racial dimension?
Well, I think that the problem with marriage in America began to become most apparent, as Moynihan pointed out, of course, back in the 1960s, among African Americans, and then quickly thereafter among the poor more generally. And why is that? Well, it's a complex question, of course, and I think part of it's about the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and discrimination, and the way in which discrimination is a stressor on relationships and on marriages. And then, two, how discrimination makes it harder for folks to have decent jobs to support their families. So these kinds of factors help us to understand in some ways why it was that the sort of black families took the first hit from many of these larger cultural and economic forces that were beginning to wash over the country in the last half century. So I think those factors help us to understand why it's the case that we sort of first see this problem emerging among African Americans, and now it's kind of spreading sort of into the heart of white middle America.
Well, the patterns that we see now among whites are what we saw among the black community in the 1960s.
Right.
But I think that the realities don't change, which is that black children need their fathers as much as all other children do. So the numbers that you're talking about there, I hear a lot of pain around that, and I certainly know a number of community leaders who are working very hard to try to change those numbers.
Well, Professor
and this report
Banks
too just also makes clear that the sort of the benefits to marriage apply across racial lines for both adults and for kids as well.
Professor Banks argues, interestingly and maybe a little bit scarily, that there's a qualitative difference in the African American community because marriagelessness has now moved way up into the middle class. It is now a solidly middle class phenomenon, which we don't see among whites.
Well, let me just say that I just want to kill one myth dead here. You cannot attribute the precipitous decline of the black family to discrimination. I mean, go back to 1940, and the marriage rates among black were many times higher than it is after the Civil Rights Revolution. So this just makes no sense at all.
But the idea is there's a kind of fragility, though. So even before the 60s,
but it
there was
doesn't explain
a higher
why
level
it's collapsed.
of single parenthood and separation among African Americans that really has been here in the country, obviously at least since the Civil War. So the point is there's a kind of underlying fragility that comes out of slavery and a history and legacy of discrimination that then positions African Americans to be more vulnerable to larger cultural and economic shifts
Okay,
that
but
hit the
then
country.
it is a cultural phenomenon. The point I'm trying to say is that I think that the cultural shift has hit blacks harder. You have a 73% out of wedlock birth rate in the African American community. Think about what that means, all right? That isn't just middle class. Now we're getting up into the upper middle class. I mean, you can't get a number like that without going all the way up through the layers of society.
When you think about it, that's a pretty daunting social experiment to be looking at for the next 20 years. Now would be, I think, probably a good time
Can
to
I just,
turn
I just want to, we are going to have an event here at the Institute next month on that book, and with Leah Ward Sears, former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Georgia, will be here. And I wish we had had Linda Malone-Klon here tonight, who's director of the African American Center for African American Marriages and Parenting at Hampton, and she had a family emergency and wasn't able to come. But there's some great leaders out there.
It's the issue people are not yet ready to talk about, but it's coming.
Well, I know some people who are talking an awful lot about it, so I'm going to make sure that
Great.
you get to know them.
I'd love that.